we're finishing up chapter 1, so we can open up the questions or the discussions to the whole chapter and try to connect the dots from the beginning part to the second part, which we read today, sections C through the end. Any questions or comments? Yeah.
This is just a question from this is the right before 2, the subject and the object. He's talking about naive realism.
Mm-hmm.
Who is he referring to explicitly in naive, the realism?
This is on page 66. Is this? Oh wait, you don't have it. Sorry.
So here it
Okay,
sounded
yeah.
a lot like Kant, but he starts it on this paragraph.
Wild naive realism. Okay, yeah. Yeah, I think what he has in mind. I mean, I'm not sure particular names here. So I mean, I don't. If you're looking for an exact example, I'm not.
No, just generally.
What's sort of going on there.
Yeah.
I think he's concerned with a type of realism that it's maybe one way of reading Kant in a sense, where you cut the appearance off from the reality in the sake of holding on to the reality to keep it from collapsing into or being reduced into the appearance. So there's something real about the book that I see, the mug that I see, the human that I see, and it has to be other than or disconnected from the appearance that I do see, or that which does appear, and so it's an attempt, I think, to preserve the reality without having it be intrinsically communicated in the appearance. And so it's a type of realism. It's maybe one way of we were trying to make sense of Kant's thing in itself, in the Solace commentary, where the alternative to what Solace says is you have this thing in itself completely disconnected from, apart from, doesn't get communicated through appearance and or objectivity, and so it almost becomes a something I know not what, and I think he's worried that way of holding on to reality leaves you with such an empty object that it's almost no object at all. Kind of like that one naive way of reading the Kantian thing in itself, where it becomes so void of any intelligibility that it's as if you should just shut up about it. And so I think he is saying the response that tries to hold on to reality can't do so in a way that cuts it off from appearance. So appearance and reality sort of go hand in hand. Another way of putting it, he says this a little bit later at one point, that appearance in some ways is part of reality. It's part of the reality of the thing, in a not a part in like, just over here there's the part of appearance, and then over here there's the part that's not the appearance. But what a tree is, this is an example he uses that I thought was helpful. What a tree is isn't it isn't void or separate from how it looks, how it smells, how it acts, which are all these secondary. You can call it secondary acts. I mean, if you want to put all this in terms of like Thomistic metaphysics, the secondary acts are the ways that the substance manifests itself, or the way that the substance communicates itself, using the Thomistic terminology. And so, the secondary act is not distinct from the primary act of the tree being a tree. In many ways, these secondary acts, the qualities and all that, all these accidents, you could think, are expressions of the substance, and therefore, in a very real sense, they're not separate from the substance. Even though they're distinct, they're accidents, they're secondary, they're not separate or isolated or apart from the substance. Does that sort of make sense? And I think he's worried that an attempt to retain or preserve reality, or the essence of things, that cuts it off from the appearance of things, is sort of doomed to fail.
So how do you think Kant would stand then? Because I know there's different interpretations, but like, obviously when he said appearance, that was what I thought.
Yeah.
I thought of Kant.
Yeah. So I think a lot of what we'll just talk about the Kant of John Sollis, which, whether that's the actual Kant, I sort of think he does a good job of interpreting Kant, but the Kant of John Sollis I don't think is terribly far from what's happening here in this section. There's a couple differences towards the end of the reading that are helpful to draw out, because I think it's going to help you distinguish what Balthasar is up to from what Sollis's Kant is up to. And from now on, I'll just say Kant, referring to Sollis's Kant. And it's within I think the context of whether or not the project of knowledge, the epistemological endeavor, the life of the knower, is one of justice or one of love. And so that comes at the very end. And I think for Sollis, it's a matter of justice. And I think what Balthasar is saying is there's something right about that the subject needs to do justice to the objectivity of things, even though it has to subjectively receive it, right? So there's this aspect of knowledge that is receptive. It's, as we were talking about last time, this active receptivity, and it wants to do justice to it. But I think what Balthasar is trying to say is the only way to really do justice to the objectivity of the other is to almost see it as having its own reality. This is where he talks about at the end as positing. There's sort of a positing of the existence of the other. Truth requires that the other be other, even though the other can't be known to be other except in the subject, right? So it's sort of like the subject can only know the object as received. Colors can only be known or experienced as seen, right? That's to say, in the eye, in the perceiver, and so there's nevertheless this fact that the color is apart from the eye, even though it can only be known in the eye by the seer, right? And so it's sort of like built within the very like logic of sight. You have to posit, and not posit as a type of inference, but the experience of seeing is the experience of seeing another, right? Not of seeing oneself, or seeing just a spontaneous phantasm or something in your imagination. And so I think what he's trying to say is the logic of knowledge necessitates that the object be apart from oneself, and that's something he thinks justice wants to safeguard, but only love can accomplish that. Love can only accomplish letting the other be other without trying to fit it into one's own schemas, which is kind of what the Kantian epistemology, the critical epistemology, seems to do. So I think there's a difference between Kant and Balthasar in this. There might be other respects, but in this respect, that's I think a significant difference. And then it also affects the way in which then the agent or the knower as a knower, as a free knower, is capable of kind of being responsible for its own role in knowing. And so there's this degree in which the truth of the object is going to now be whether the truth comes to light for that object is going to rest on the subject. The subject is the space in which that object is going to come to light or not. So there's a I don't know if a burden, but not in a negative sense. There's a weight placed on the subject in bringing the object to light through his free actions. He can bring it to light, and I think what Balthasar is trying to say is those free actions are going to only allow for knowledge if those are understood within the context of love, because it's precisely love where you get that the other is other. This is sometimes what happens in like relationships. We'll use a cheesy example. In like relationships, sometimes in like high school or college, not people who have just gotten engaged. So this is the. But the idea is you don't want you don't want hopefully the person you love to merely be doing the things that like you want them to do. So it's like, put this in even a more concrete way. I think my wife really likes eating out at this restaurant, even though that's like never true because we never go out to eat. But no, we did. Actually, we do. Only when we get gift cards. So we went to Chipotle, and it would be like, I am simply doing the actions that I think she would want me to do. That seems sort of loving, but it also it needs to be more than that, because that's simply just the level of like that's servile obedience, which might play a role at a certain point in love, but it's not merely that you just do what the other person wants you to do, and if you do that, then that's love. It's almost like, which is why it's hard sometimes for people that are really good friends or people that are in love. It's hard for them to make decisions because it's almost as if the decision they want to make is what the other person wants. Their good is the other person's good, but then if that's reciprocated, then you kind of see this like circle that occurs, right? Does that, you know what I'm talking about? Like, okay, I want to eat where you want to eat, and then my wife says, well, the funny thing is the place I want to eat at is the place that you want to eat at. And then I say, well, that's kind of funny then, because now it's the place that you want to eat at, and you get it, and it cycles, right? And then you're left, fasting or something. And that allowing the other the space to be other, and sort of quote affirming that. I know this sounds so cheesy and like cheesy counseling terminology. But it affirms the other as other without having to have it fit one's own ideas of what would be good or what would be intelligible or what would be meaningful. Which is why oftentimes the truth is not pleasing. It's not pleasant. To know something often means you have to revise a lot, especially self-knowledge. A lot of times, this is something Pascal talks about in the Pensées, that we're often afraid of what we're going to discover when we know ourselves, because we kind of have this inclination that, we aren't what we think we are. And we have this initial resistance because of all the consequences that this might have for us. But anyway, the truth has its own reality apart from the knower, but it's this reality that's apart from the knower that precisely is capable of coming to expression, so to speak, coming to light in the act of knowing. Just as the color is this reality apart from the seer, but it can only come to light, or it has its meaning only in the seer, in the act of seeing. But precisely in seeing, you know that it's a seeing of another, but through one's own action of seeing. Does that kind of make sense? So it's an attempt to unite the external and the internal, the subject and the object. Yeah. Does that any questions, thoughts about that, or anything from the chapter thus far? We're kind of going around the.
I have a question about the relation between subject and object.
Yeah.
So he's talking about pretty much they need each other, right?
Yeah.
But in a way, it almost seems like something has to be an object and a subject. He's talking about the tree, the tree needs to be known, so it's trying to be known. But the trying to be known isn't acting like a subject. So is everything like a subject and an object? Just it depends on the relation.
Yeah. Good. So there is this. So this we talked about this a little bit at the beginning of class last time. Aquinas has that passage that I read where he distinguishes levels of being, and he distinguishes those levels of being in terms of interiority, which you could think of that in terms of the ways in which something can internalize what's external to it. The internal space of its existence is another roundabout metaphorical way of maybe putting this. And I think all things that exist have some degree of that. Even the elements, they have some degree of interiority. There's some small degree in which they are a subject, in the sense that they can receive the actions of another. They're recipients of communication of another. Now, in this case, the communication which they're receiving is not color, it's not sounds, it's going to be some simple brute physical force. But it's still the like this, me knocking the mug. The mug in some ways is communicating its existence into the table, or to the table, through its causal relationship. So causation, in the Thomistic view, which Balthasar is sort of using as background, is communication. It's just very low-level communication. And it's a type of then analogous knowledge. The table gets some sort of analogous knowledge or awareness in an analogous, emphasis on analogousness. The table is aware of the mug because it's affected by the mug. It somehow internalizes or takes in the activity of the mug. And so I think there's a way in which the table is an object in relation to me, and perhaps to other things, and it itself is a subject in relation to things. But here, I think, is what what Balthasar is trying to do is there's a way in which the perfection of a subject, and Aquinas talks about this in that passage from last time, that the perfection of being is also the perfection of subjectivity, in the sense that it can become self-knower. So the table is not capable of knowing itself or receiving itself. It can perhaps receive other things, but it can't receive it itself, or be aware of itself, or know itself, be conscious of itself. And so I think what he's trying to say in this chapter is the subject and the object distinction is one that can attain or obtain between numerically identical things. So in virtue of me being a self-knower, I'm both an object and a subject. But as object and as subject, I'm sort of different. There's something really strange. Like, to know yourself requires a type of duality. You become the object of self-knowledge. It's kind of like what Aristotle says about self-movers. They can only be self-movers in virtue of there being a distinction internal to them, such that one part of them sort of is responsible for the movement of another part of them. Self-knowers, I know it's different when you get finally to God as a self-knower, but you're pushing to a level of analogy there that and what knowledge means and self-knowledge means and subject. So, but take it for what it's worth that there's an analogy, I think, between how a self-mover is possible and how a self-knower is possible, and what that does is it requires there to be some implicit distinction between the subject and the object. And so I think you're right that there is a way in which all objects are a type of subject. At the level of the perfection of being, I think you have subjectivity at its height, which is capable of recognizing its own subjectivity as an object, right? I can come to think about what I am. I can come to think about myself, and this is what is happening here. Is that's the perfection of subjectivity, but it also then perfects myself as an object. My objectivity. It's like you've probably all known people that have walked around the world and haven't reflected on themselves or examined their lives, and we all know what the unexamined life is worth. I think the heightened level of subjectivity correlates with a heightening of objectivity. And so this is why when the knower knows the object, say a tree, the object is interestingly elevated more than it. It's now existing at a level that it couldn't exist at, so to speak, on its own, because the tree can't be a self-knower. It can't, of its own accord, it can't be an object of knowledge. Or it can't, of its own accord, it can't actually be an object of, it can be potentially an object of knowledge, but it can't actually be an object of knowledge on its own. Right? It needs something. And this is why there's this distinction in the human being between the passive and the active intellect too, where like you can be self-conscious in a way, but that once again requires a type of distinction between this potential object of knowledge and this actual object, or this actual knowing. So that the knowing of the tree elevates the tree to as he puts it, to a status or a level. I forget the technical word he uses, that it would not have otherwise been able to attain, which is where the real full level of truth comes. That's where the object really comes to light and what it is. It's when it's known. Just as the color comes to its fullness as color in being seen. Now it is, if we leave this green book on the table and everyone leaves and it sits in the room, it's still a green book, but it's not actually seen, right? I don't think anyone can deny that fact, that when everyone leaves the room, the book will no longer be actually seen. And therefore, the green of the book is now in some ways lesser of a color in that it's gone from being an actual object of perception to a potential object of perception. It's still green because it could be, and it's not. You don't want to sort of picture it as like, okay, when you leave, it goes out of existence. That's not exactly the way to think about what happens when you're not seeing an object.
It's like less than an object? Or less the completion of what it's called.
Yeah, that might be a way to think of that. It's just not perfect.
Just like the man who doesn't self-reflect is like less man than the man who does stuff.
Yeah, they're both men. I mean, another way also to put this would be just in a biological, organic, developmental stage that the child, the 1-year-old, is maybe there's some debate about what 1-year-olds, but let's push it back in a little bit. A 2-day-old. 2-day-old is not in the sense that most people walking around the world would mean by rational. The 2-day-old's not rational. They can't make decisions. They can't think about themselves. They probably don't have any concepts at all. So in a very real sense, although new parents don't like to think about this, but the 2-day-old's not rational in that sense. But here's where like the whole enchilada lies, that the 2-day-old is still in a different sense rational. There's a potential there that nothing else in the natural world, like trees or armadillos, has, right? Even though the tree and the 2-day-old both can't know themselves at that moment, they can't make decisions and yada yada yada. There's a significant difference, and it's because the one has a type of potential that the other one doesn't have, and it's just for the human and this organic biological example. The human can kind of develop itself. We call this like nature. It can perfect itself. It can develop according to its natural course, and bring itself to the stage of knowing and being actually rational. But it has to do this in context with other things. Like it needs food and it needs all these other things to aid it in developing and becoming fully actual as a rational agent. Without food, without human beings that talk to it, it won't ever reach the height of actuality of being rational. And now it will be rational at that lower level of potentially capable of reasoning. But if you never speak to a child, they're not going to develop in a proper way, and they're never going to be at that second level, the higher level of rational. Does that sort of make sense? And so what I think what's going on here is something analogous, where you have things that are knowledge But they're not knowledge. They're not, or maybe by knowledge, what I mean would be like known. They're known, or even true in the way of talking about knowability. But they kind of depend on something. Now, of course, they have that apart from this other thing they depend on, just as the baby is rational at that potential sense. But it depends on something in order to be fully rational. Likewise, the objects are objects of knowledge in that potential sense, but they depend on something to be actual objects of knowledge. And that thing that they depend on is a knowing subject. And so it's like the knowing subject does a service to the object. It brings it to perfection, just as the mother does a service to the child by feeding the child, and so the mother is sort of responsible for why the child becomes rational. The teachers become responsible for why the students become rational, I think. But the idea is they play a role in that, but it's still of the perfection of that other thing. So knowing the object is something that the knower does to perfect it, but it really is a perfecting of that other thing. It takes on a heightened existence. It now becomes it exists in the light of knowledge, and therefore in the full light of truth. The human does to the creature in a participatory way that God does to the creature, right? The perfection of the creature is found in God's knowing it, and the human rational agent sort of participates in that. Right? The human rational agent is capable of doing what God does in a created way, right? In a creaturely way. Does that make sense? Yeah, Jack.
One question I have is just about objects that maybe no one is looking at. Isn't God always looking at that object? I guess in a different sense, and if so, then how would us, perceiving an object make it any perfected?
Yeah, because doesn't God perfect it? That's sort of the idea. Like if God always knows it, and its being is constituted by God's knowing it, like what the heck do humans need to do then?
Yeah.
Can't we just get like an infinitely long spring break or something? I'm like, you don't have to do anything. You don't have to do any work. Good. That's a good question. Any thoughts on how Balthasar might respond to that question? If God knows everything, and therefore its perfection as an object of knowledge, or as an object, is constituted by God's knowing, by God's sort of subjectivity to it. What do humans do? What do human agents do? Human knowers. What role do we have then?
What does that have to do with we actually become perfected as we know more things? Just know, the world.
Yeah, so part of it has to do with us. That's a perfection of us, to know those things. But I think what Balthasar is trying to say is that but there's also something about the object is perfected in the way that the human knows it, and that's I don't want to say apart from, because it's not apart from, but that's distinct from the perfection it has in virtue of God knowing it. Here's the way I'll try to cash out what's going on here, even though this might not be helpful, because I'm going to use some, even though I've been doing this quite a bit, so I apologize if you're not very familiar with sort of Thomistic lingo, but I'll try to give some examples maybe. So you have God is a second. No, sorry. God is a primary cause of everything. He's the creator. He's the creator of all creation, all creatures. And in a direct, immediate type of way, all creatures are created ex nihilo. So it's not like God created way, way, way back when there was this guy named Adam, and he did this thing called creation over the void and the murky waters, and he breathed some spirit here and there, and then you had the creation, thing, and then creation's done with because it's the seventh day or the sixth day or whenever creation ended. And then it's probably the sixth day because the seventh day is when you rest. Is that right? So the sixth day, right, into the sixth day. And then, creation's done, check, and then it's done, and now you're like, well, man, wouldn't it have been so awesome if we were there at the beginning of when creation was occurring? Wouldn't that have been cool to see it happening? Bad way to think about it, because creation is occurring right now. This is what's occurring right now is the act of creation. You are like in the midst of Genesis right now in that sense, that it's an ex nihilo act occurring right now. Here's an analogous. We're going to ultimately get back to your question, Jack, but we have to take a trip through secondary causation land. So a little detour. So you have a wine glass, and you pour wine in the glass, and you say, okay, we put the wine in the glass. The wine has the shape of the glass now. It's like a goblet shape. And you say, okay, now that the wine's in the shape of the glass, we can take the glass away and go wash it, because the wine's just gonna, it's already in that shape. And you take the glass away, and what happens when you take the glass away? What happens to the wine? Of course, that's sort of a idiotic question to ask, borderlining on rhetorical. It does not retain its shape. So the wine can only have the shape of the glass if the causal presence of the glass remains, right? So it's the way that you could put it is the wine's having the shape is simultaneous with its being shaped. Does that make sense? Why are we talking about this? Because that's exactly the type of relationship that's occurring in creation. Creatures exist, analogous to the wine having the shape, simultaneous with their being created, right? Their having been created is a simultaneous event with their being created, and so what it is for you to exist and for you to do things is always going to be within this broader umbrella of God sort of upholding. You can only speak in analogies and metaphors about this, but God upholding you in existence. And now we can kind of start to get back into this question of what does the human do if God is the knower in the fullest sense? Why do human knowers matter? Because what God is upholding into existence at every moment that a human exists is a knower. And not just any old knower, but a knower of created things, right? A knower of created things that's open to knowing the truth itself, the divine. And so the activity that we're created to do is this activity of knowing. Okay, now the activity that let's say the tree has, virtue of being a tree, that God is continually upholding it. He's continually upholding it, saying, okay, tree, stay in existence. That's not exactly what he's saying, but he probably spoke in like Hebrew or something. And the tree is an agent. It's doing something. It's growing, but also it's existing as colored. It's existing in all of its sort of visual glory, and its essence is like what underlies all of these particular actions that it does. All of that is made possible in relation to created knowers of it. So it's like created knowable objects are created for the sake of created knowers, and created knowers are created for the sake of created knowable objects. And Balthasar talks about this at one point. All of this is possible only because of this background condition of God already knowing that whole situation. That knowers are for objects, and objects are for knowers. And that's what allows the knower to say, I don't know what I'm going to find when I come out here, but I sort of have to come out here into the world. And the world says, I don't know if I'm going to find a knower, but I sort of have to look for a knower. That only makes sense. That's only a possible disposition for these things to have, this type of radical openness prior to having contact, so to speak, with each other. They're already disposed to each other. And that's possible only because God has this higher order type of knowledge. And so in a sense, they're created together, in a sense. The object of knowledge and the knower are sort of created together. And here's how Balthasar puts it. This is just 2, 3. Hold on. 1, 2, 3, 4 paragraphs in. Section C, the object. 4 paragraphs in. It's the paragraph that begins with for an object. For an object to be knowable, it must not only be measurable in principle, but also already measured in fact. Now, since the object is not measured by itself insofar as it is an object, or in order to measure it would have to be a subject. So, since the object is not measured by itself insofar as it is an object, and since the finite subject already presupposes that the object is in fact measured, it follows that the object's measure must lie in the hands of the infinite subject God. So it's like the fact that I can know things and the fact that things can be known can't rest fundamentally in me nor fundamentally in that object, but it's got to rest somewhere where there's a perfect union already of subject and object, a perfect sort of oneness where that object is perfectly found in its perfection within subjectivity. Another way to put it, objectivity finds its fullest expression only in a subject, and that simply just is what creation is. That's just what creation is. Is that the objects of creation originate from a subjectivity, from a knowing, right? From the divine idea, and that's the background condition that lets created subjects and created objects form a unity. Does that make sense? Questions, comments? Yeah.
So is that why, like an object being brought to its actuality, the fullness of truth, is only like fully completed when the human does it in participation with with God's idea, I think is how he puts it.
Yeah. Yeah. So that the human knows the object in a participatory way with how God knows the object. Now, how does God know the object? Here's what's like crazy. God knows the object in a sense that's one with Him, because what all creation ultimately is, it originates in Him. But what does the ex nihilo part of creation signify? That it's like originates not in Him. It's completely other than Him. It's like it creation has to be really, 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 with an emphasis and italicized and you underline, really distinct from God, right? There has to be a real distinction. And so the way that God knows the tree is that it becomes other than God, right? His knowledge of the tree is so perfect that it lets the tree be entirely other than him. Otherwise, it would be like a Spinoza monism or a Parmenidean monism. Like all there would be God. God would know things, but in virtue of knowing things, there would be this self-knowledge, because all things are found in God. And so what the created world would be kind of, maybe another example, if you've read Berkeley, would be like kind of like a Berkeleyan idealism or something, where all of this is just ultimately in the mind of God. This is like one great TV show or dream in the mind of God is what creation is. But that's not exactly the way that Balthasar is thinking about this, sort of making reference to Aquinas' stuff here, is that knowing really does find its perfection in there being a distinct other. And that has to be the case for God's knowledge to be creative. The object of knowledge really does have to be capable of being other than him. Otherwise, there's no creation. It's just, we're just like appendages of the divine substance, and we're kind of modes of God or ideas of God, and we don't really have our own existence. And so God's knowledge gives rise to a radical objectivity. It lets the other be other entirely, truly, truly ontologically. What the human is doing is we're recapitulating, as he puts it, or we're reenacting that type of knowing, but it doesn't actually ontologically make the other, but it brings to light in a created way the otherness of that mug or that tree or whatever, in its like fullness, so that I can actually be proven wrong by it. Here's what's interesting about like Socratic or Platonic philosophy, is it's like this recognition of the truth, which lets you be judged by the truth, rather than the philosopher is typically thought of as like the person who judges the truth. I'm trying to figure out the truth, which is the exact opposite of the Platonic tradition, and I think even probably you could say the Aristotelian tradition in this context, because it's saying you can be proven wrong. There's a truth of the object that allows you to be corrected, but that can only be the case if you have the proper reception of it. If you receive the object in such a way that you're trying to just fit it into your paradigms, then you can't be wrong, right? It requires a type of, I want to receive it, but I want it to still be what it truly is. I want to, know my wife, but not simply for the sake of being able to see whether she corresponds with what I already think she is. And hope she is, or want her to be, something like that. Does that sort of make sense? So it's a type of knowledge that's a type of charity, or one. There's this crazy philosopher who I love, William Desmond. He has this idea of the agapeic mind, which is like the mind trying to know something, but it wants it to not get reduced to like the subject's own like excitement, which kind of corresponds to love, where you get so excited that you sometimes feel that you're dominating a conversation. This always happens when I teach, because I kind of get paid to do this, but like you're so excited to be with this person that you find yourself like overpowering everything, and so you kind of have to temper that in a way. It's good in one sense, but it needs to be tempered, and so you kind of need to let things take their course. And this is kind of that type of drama, that knowledge needs to know things in such a way that it lets them take their course, their natural course, so that they manifest, they reveal, they communicate themselves according to how they really are. Does that kind of make sense? This is certainly not something that can be understood passively. So it takes a lot of work. Any comments or thoughts about this? Even something that you thought kind of made sense, but you're looking for another example. Did I tell you about my professor in grad school who would wait like 3 minutes, and we had a clock in the class, and that would actually tick, and it would cause so much tension that people would just break. Even if they didn't want to ask a question, they just would because of like the awkward tension. But I'm the one that typically breaks. I can't handle that type of silence. But that's probably a mark of my own failures.
This is two paragraphs from the end of C. He talks about like the state of becoming. Could you just kind of elucidate a little bit more on that? I mean, it's an interesting like way of talking about it. Obviously, because like at least for me, it referred back to a more Platonic viewpoint.
Yeah. So what does the paragraph begin with?
And so on the side of the object.
Okay. So towards the beginning of that?
It's like, I don't know, 10 lines down from and so on the side of the
object. Oh, okay. Okay, let's just read until we get down to the becoming stuff so we can put this all in context. And so on the side of the object, we get the complement of what on the side of the subject was a nearness to, within a predominant distance from God. So once again, here this sort of paradox that the nearness to God is found within a distance from God. The creature as creature has to be other than God in a way, right? That's the way that the creature is known by God for what it is, right? It's known as creature, and therefore as in some ways distant from Him. Even the object's ontological truth has the form of receptivity, not only because its temporal existence flows ever anew from God, but above all because from moment to moment God is originating, adjudging, and presenting the creature's idea to it. For its part, the creature never possesses its own norm without constantly and increasingly having to receive it as a gift from God. This, I think, goes back to some of the stuff we were saying earlier about just creation. Ex nihilo is this continual thing. Though the wine doesn't say, okay, I've received the shape of the wine glass, so I don't need the wine glass anymore. It receives it. Yeah, but it's a receiving that always needs to occur. It's a continual or a constant receiving. The object is characterized, therefore, as a being that in its innermost depths is in a state of becoming, analogous to how the wine in its being is being shaped is found in its continual state of becoming shaped, or it's constantly in effect, right? It's a stretched out effect is one way to think about what the being shaped of the wine is. It's not like, okay, here's the effect and it's done and then it's there. And analogously, the creature, you could think of it as the creature is this: take the effect and you just stretch it out. We tend to think like building a treehouse is like how God creates humans. You kind of put a little bit of sinew here, and a little bit of bone here, put some marrow in, drop a little bit of pneuma up in there, and then you get a human. Okay, and then you're like, oh, there's the human. We've made it. That's how you build a swing set or something. And the problem with that analogy, comparing those analogies of God creating and humans building, is that the building comes to an end in a way, right? The building of the swing set is completed. The building of, so to speak, or the creating of a human is sort of always completed when a human exists, because there it is, the human. Ta-da! And God's like, ta-da, there's the human. But it's a ta-da that's like, ta-da! And it keeps going on and on, right? Because it's like, here's the completion, and it's a completion that's stretched out temporally. You kind of got a little goofy when you teach sometimes. So this is, if you ever, even if you thought, no, that's all you got to do when you're in like grade school, elementary ed. But no, it persists. Okay, so that idea, I think, is what he has in mind, that the being is in its becoming, which is a sort of Platonic idea. But I think what he's wanting to say is that the creature is always a being created, and therefore, in the being created, it's a becoming. It's a being. It really does have its own ontological substantial weight, but it's a substantial weight that it continually receives. And it's not like God's like he's like throwing these like being darts at the human. It's like, make sure I gotta always make sure he has a little bit of being with him, and he's like, holding him in existence by continually like doing a bunch of different things. It's one act that exists in a temporally stretched out ways, and perhaps a better way to think of it, and so that the being is in its it's becoming the being of song or dance. This is, I'm thinking like T.S. Eliot, if you've ever read Four Quartets, that the being of a song, like if you're thinking about like I don't know, Billy Joel jamming away on the Piano Man. And that song only exists as a becoming, as a happening, as an ongoing sort of thing. It's like, okay, let's hit pause on the Billy Joel song, and well, when you hit pause, the song stops. Right? If you want the song, you got to keep it going. But the entirety of the song can't exist at any one moment because of the very fact that its existence is found in a temporal stretch type of manner. And so I think this is what he's kind of getting at. He goes on. I could be completely making this up, but I think this is what he has in mind. Becoming here does not mean that the object's existence has a temporal form, although that's a helpful analogy, while its essence, unperturbed by coming to be and passing away in time, supposedly represents its supratemporal truth. So it's not like the essence is the temporal aspect, and then the being its existence is the temporal aspect, and then its essence is the untemporal or the eternal thing, right? Right. So in a sense, both I think he's going to say are have a type of becoming to it. For its essence is precisely what exists, but what exists cannot be unaffected cannot be unaffected by alteration. Although individual and specific being remain identical throughout this change, and so enable permanent and valid, general and necessary knowledge, the being's framework of meaning is subject to change. It may change by occupying a new position in the context of the world, or because God himself directly intervenes. For whenever it pleases him, God can impose on any being new tasks and goals, new purposes, and new resources for fulfilling them. So that there's something eternal, or unchanging, unbecoming, and not in the sense of off-putting, but static about the human and about all things. They have a share in stasis. They're stable. There's something quasi-eternal about them, right? And that's their species or their essence. But what it is to here's what's strange about, like, say, the universal oak tree. The universal oak tree is a static thing, but what oak trees are changing things. So it's like an eternal idea of things that change. And so you don't want to have too sharp of a separation between the two, because then it would be an eternal idea of unchangingness, and therefore it's not an idea of an oak tree, right? So I think he's trying to link link that up with what a human is, and therefore it's continually this. Another way to think of it, the idea of Billy Joel's song "Piano Man," it stays the same whether he's playing it in Berlin or whether he's playing it in Orlando, right? Maybe little things change here and there, but the song is a generic. It's the same, but in virtue of it being the same, it's then like the same changing thing whenever you have it, and so it's like it's always kind of rooted with change or becoming in a way. Yeah. Okay. Here's a passage that I found interesting, and then if you have any questions, please ask. Because there's a handful of other things I can talk about, but okay. This is right before the section, the object and the subject. So it's that little introductory passage for section D, and it is towards the end of that first long paragraph. Maybe halfway through actually. As the mutual immanence and completion of subject and object, intellectual knowledge is an unexpected event that surprises both and cannot be deduced from them in any way. Just as a man who sets off on a long journey does not know what will happen to him or how he will be changed when he returns after years of absence, so too the subject does not know what the adventure of knowledge will bring him. This made me think of like Bilbo Baggins or something. Okay, but by the same token, the object no more knows what to expect in the space opened within the subject than a guest knows how he will be received and hosted in another's home. Both subject and object will be fulfilled by coming together, but the fulfillment will be a wonder and a gift for both. Their encounter will reveal them to each other, even as the revelation of the other will contain for each the revelation of itself, which can come about only in the other. And so there's a way in which the revelation of the object can only occur in the subject, and a revelation of the subject occurs in the object. And so they sort of reveal to each other what they are. Another way to maybe put this is that their logos is found in relation, so that you can't think about a subject apart from an object, nor an object apart from a subject. And I think this is where, in the broader scheme of things, he's ultimately going with this as a theologic. As at the order of creation, you get this distinction, and you can get it even at the level of like natural theology between the creature and God. But internal to God himself, there's this type of the revelation of the Father sort of in the Son, and the communication of the Father by the Son or through the Son, and there being a type of awareness that you can't have these being separate from each other. There's a type of prior union, underlying their distinction. Okay, and so I think he's sort of ultimately pushing in this direction in the course of the whole work, and he's trying to map it out at the created order, and it seems to be that this is the way the created order works, and it's the way that the created order works because it's the way that God in relation, or maybe that's the created order in relation to God, how that is. And then it would be expected then that if you read Pearson's paper, the agents cause things which are like themselves. Then that would be kind of how God in Himself, God's own self-knowledge would be. What it is for God to know Himself would then take a structure that's sort of like this as well, which I think is kind of interesting. Okay. Anything else? Any final thoughts? No. Okay. The last. I don't know.